Good evening. Good evening, and welcome both to everybody here in the lecture theatre and also to our online audience to the British School at Rome and to the fourth Talk in the City of Rome series, a programme of public lectures accompanying the BSR's annual postgraduate course, where students from universities across the UK spend 2 months at the BSR studying the history, archaeology and topography of Rome. I'm Christopher Shevitsky, the course director, and it is an enormous pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Tesse Stek. Tesse is Professor in Archaeology of the Western Mediterranean at Groningen University, but is perhaps best known to everyone here as the Director of the Royal Netherlands Institute in Rome. Located just across the road, this has the dual benefit of hopefully being convenient for tonight's speakers' travel arrangements, and is also a good reminder of what excellent company the BSR is in with its neighbours here in the Valle Giulia. Tesse's research centres around the formation of Roman imperialism and its interactions with pre-existing polities and people. The complexity of this subject is matched by the complexity of his approach, which combines ancient history and epigraphy with new archaeological fieldwork. Over the last 2 decades, this has included the Topino Area Archaeological Project, which mapped and analysed ancient settlement patterns in a valley in Molise. Tesse's fieldwork carried out fieldwork around the Roman town of Acernia in the Apennines and co-directed the landscapes of early Roman colonization project, also in Italy, and which examined the role of Roman non-urban settlements in the formation phase of Roman Empire. Elsewhere in the Mediterranean, in 2018, Tesse began a new project in Portugal, which sought to better understand the large-scale trends in expanding Roman Empire from the 4th century BC to the 1st century AD. To list all of Tesse's numerous publications would infringe far too much time on the talk that we're actually here to listen to. Therefore, I'll limit it to just his books. These include Cult, Places and Cultural Change by Amsterdam University Press in 2009, Roman Republican Colonization in 2014, The Impact of Rome on Cult Places and Religious Practices in Ancient Italy, 2015, The Archaeology of Imperial Landscapes, a Comparative Study of Empires in the Ancient Near East and Mediterranean World, 2018, The State of the Samnites in 2021, and The Archaeology of Roman Portugal in its Western Mediterranean context in 2022. From the title of tonight's lecture, we would also appear to be benefiting from Tesse's expertise on Roman Italy, religion and colonization. And so with how cults shaped Roman colonization, will you please welcome Professor Tesse Stek.
Thank you very much, Christopher. It's an honor to be here. It's not that far away indeed, but it's still very good to have a more structured way of debating our research. And I'm really very fond of the special relationship between the BSR and the Dutch Institute. We have been doing many things together lately, such as our last conference here on the Biferno Valley. And I hope indeed that we can continue on this. So many thanks to speak for this special seminar. I have been made aware by Chris that not every one of you is an archaeologist or Roman historian or something around that topic matter. So I would suggest that you just ask questions whenever something is not clear, or otherwise people with much more expertise can correct me, of course. I hope this can be an open dialogue, because actually much of the things that we're going to see are not concluded in any way. Because indeed, few issues have been growing so problematic as our conventional understanding of early Roman colonialism and the role of cult and religious ritual with it. On the one hand, we have to do with a rapidly evolving debate on early Roman imperialism, and especially the character of Roman colonization in the mid-Republican period, so the 4th and to the 3rd centuries BC. As we will see, the image of progressing urbanism and Roman civilization has recently been seriously compromised, and we have actually just started to pick up the pieces and try to build new understandings of Roman expansion and its material footprint. On the other, we have to deal with an equally cumbersome inheritance of studies on Roman religion, which until recently was particularly conservative and static. Roman religious history for long used to be a description of the pantheon of the festive calendar, the fasti, without much appreciation for the diachronic aspect and the development over time. This is methodologically challenging because evidence from all time periods are fitted together to create one coherent image. And indeed, the study of the impact of Roman colonialism on cults and religion outside of Rome is also difficult because often evidence from far-flung places in the Italian peninsula and the provinces has actually been used to reconstruct the situation at Rome itself. Although poets as Ovid present religious ritual and cult as something ancient and unchangeable, we know from anthropology and sociology that religious ritual and cults are actually very fluid and changeable over time and can vary hugely according to the historical and geographical context. As a result, there is considerable uncertainty about the character of Roman colonization and the impact of Roman colonialism on indigenous cults. However, notwithstanding these serious reasons not to, I will try to discuss parts of the puzzle with you tonight, and this will consist of a combination of historiographical revisions, budding new archaeological field data, as well as agendas for future work. All considered, I will try to argue that cults indeed play an important role in shaping colonial society, but in different ways and with a different logic behind it than often has been imagined. And in order to analyze this, it's important to approach the topic with due consideration of spatial and diachronic developments. The data at hand are necessarily fragmentary and of a very diverse type. As we will see, this paucity of data has left considerable wiggle room for modern reconstructions of Roman colonialism and its cultic aspects. The scholars who attempted these reconstructions were often influenced, of course, by contemporary conditions and concerns, as we all are. And along the road, I'll try to highlight some clear cases of conflation of ancient Rome and modern colonialism. And maybe I can start with this image that you see. This is a photograph I took from the air on a paraglider, flying towards the ancient colony of Alba Fucens, which is to the left of this image. What you actually see is a landscape that could have easily been the cover of a handbook on Roman colonization, on Roman landscapes, but it's actually, of course, an invention of the 20th century. So in one way or another, a typical Roman colony was constructed in the end. Rome was itself conceived in ancient tradition as a colony, of course, first of Troy, and then via Lavinium of Alba Longa. Literary sources suggest that already in the regal and archaic periods, Rome engaged in expansionist activities involving territorial appropriation and the founding of new communities. Even Romulus himself is said to have established colonies. And while these accounts are, of course, partly mythical and anachronistic, they may certainly reflect an early reality of mobility and expansion. But Roman colonization, in a more recognizable form, appears to have intensified after the Latin War in 3038 BC, when Rome formally asserted dominance over its neighbors. Between then and the Second Punic War, some 33 colonies were founded, a period described by scholars such as Edward Toko Selman as the golden age of colonization, and indeed coinciding with Rome's conquest of the Italian peninsula. Colonization subsequently slowed, evolving into new forms in the 2nd century BC, with the Grecan land reforms and veteran settlements. We will be talking mostly about this so-called golden age of Roman colonization. The motivations behind colonization have been widely debated. Military strategy is commonly cited, especially by Machiavelli, for instance, but colonies apparently also serve to alleviate social and economic pressures in Rome by redistributing land to the urban poor. This incentive is mostly documented for the early and late Republican period. Additionally, colonies have been interpreted in modern scholarship as vehicles for the diffusion of Roman political structures, culture, language, and technology into the Italic and pre-Roman territories. And these interpretations frame the colonies indeed as instrumental in processes of what has been called Romanization, preparing the Italic peoples, Samnites, Etruscans, Umbrians, for integration into the Roman state. And this is often presented as a good thing and as a sign of progress, of course. And some of the first pioneers of this approach is, for instance, Plinio Fraccaro, already in the 1920s and 30s. However, the trope is also found in Lipsius. Justus Lipsius had a very clear idea in the 16th century of both the character and the specific role of colonies in a broader imperialistic strategy. What I call the Lipsian model, also to avoid the term Romanization, sees colonies as instruments of civilization. The new cities would be small copies of Rome, with typically Roman forms, Capitolian temples, and Senate buildings. And of course, he is just part of a very long history of Roman colonization studies that actually already starts in the Roman period, in the imperial period at least. However, there is a very important moment in time, which is the amazing discoveries that are being made after World War II at the Latin colonies of Alba Fucens, where the previous aerial images from, and the colony of Cosa, which was installed in 273 BC, Alba Fucens at the end of the 4th century, 303. And the discoveries by the American school at Cosa and the Belgian excavators at Alba Fucens, and a little bit later also in Fregelle, of course, invigorated immensely the notion that Roman expansion and urbanism went hand in hand, and that urbanism and Romanization are more or less to be conflated. They're logically related. Almost complete town plans were uncovered, as well as impressive remains of political and sacred buildings. And in many ways, these town plans and the public architecture seem to reflect shared values and political ideas, based indeed on the model city of Rome. Some of the best known examples of this are is the appearance of circular political meeting places, comitia, in the colonies, and which indeed could suggest to many scholars that these colonies copied the model of Rome, not only in the social political organization, but also in the physical layout. And this is really fixed in this time period. As a result, the central cult buildings present in many colonies were interpreted as copies of the central cult place at Rome on the capital. This happened, for instance, with the cult place on the highest point of the settlement at Cosa, and with the remains of temples partly preserved by the incorporation into later churches, as often happens, at the colony of Sora, which is also founded in 303 BC, just as Alba, and in Isernia, founded a little bit later in 263 BC, and we will talk more about that colony later. The idea was that from these colonial sites, this model, this urban model, would consequently have spread further into the hinterland by a process of osmosis. But also the surrounding rural territory would have also been radically reorganized with the establishment of colony. As in the primary urban settlements, the neatly divided lands seem to reflect an entirely new socio-political organization and new economic basis. The neat and ordered subordination of nature that transpired from the man-made centuriation grids made a strong impact on scholars of that generation and was often linked with the allegedly firm and resolute Roman mind. John Bradford, for instance, in 1957, speaks of absolute self-assurance and great technical competence, end of quote, with which the Romans would have superimposed the same formal framework on landscapes as different as the Po Valley and desert-like Tunisia. In historiography, Lipsius' model of civilization is combined with this clear notion of the socio-economic basis of the colony, namely agriculture, where the colonists themselves cultivated their own fields. I call this the Cincinnatus model, named after the example of the general from the early mythical history of Rome. Cincinnatus, as a model veteran, was plowing his own piece of land when the Senate called him in panic to help against an invasion. He exchanged the plow for the sword, but as soon as he had defeated the enemy, he resumed his plowing 15 days later. Service and frugality are the Roman core values here. On the standard city-state view of republican colonies, a clear division between center and hinterland is expected. One might think, for instance, of the illustrations in the Corpus Acumensorum Romanorum, to see here. On this view, indeed, Roman colonization entailed a substantial reorganization of rural space. Following the city-state scenario, a sacred demarcation of the territory of the type proposed for the polis of mainland Greece and Magna Graecia would seem natural. As is well known, it has been assumed that the development of extra-urban cult places played a crucial role in the formation and in the territorial definition of the Greek city-states, the polis, in the first place. The idea was first developed for the Greek colonies and then most famously elaborated into a comprehensive model for both the Greek colonies and the mainland by François de Polignac. Rural or extra-urban cult places, in his view, demarcated the territory of the civic community. To use de Polignac's words, they would have marked the city's control over the terrain. Related religious rituals, and in particular identical cults and rites performed in both central and the peripheral cult sites, thus defined and consolidated the structure of the city-state. A very similar scenario has been proposed for the Etruscan city-states, where frontier sanctuaries would have visually and ideologically marked the territory of the community, for instance, the work of Ciferero. Now, such a model has also been proposed for the city-state of Rome itself. This is an image of Lully. Cult places located at a set distance from the center would have collectively demarcated the ancient territory of Rome, called the Ager Romanus Antiquus. Specific territorial rituals and festivals, including processions such as the Ambarvalia, would have woven these cults together so as to constitute the sacralized territorial definition of the Roman city-state. With respect to the colonies that Rome founded, the model posits the replication of the sacred landscape of the city of Rome is indeed the one we normally encounter in modern scholarship. For instance, Daniel Gargola, in his Lands, Laws, and Politics, explicitly imagines that the configuration at Rome, in particular the Capitolium at the center and the boundary sanctuaries demarcating the Ager Romanus Antiquus, as the model for all Roman colonies. So the territory of which would likewise have been demarcated ritually by cult sites on the territorial border. This hypothesis, widely accepted in both Anglophone and Italian scholarship, logically also presumes regular rituals whereby, in Gargola's words, the colonial priests and magistrates confirmed possession of their territory, analogously to Rome. It therefore seems worthwhile first to briefly review the evidence for Rome itself before discussing the evidence for the colonies. Even if, as I will argue a bit later, the situation in Rome itself is not necessarily indicative of what happens in the Roman colonies, it is still important to understand the entire complex of arguments that underlies the current image. The idea that a ring of cult sites around the city of Rome, located on its major arteries at specific distances, demarcated the ancient border, was established long ago. It is important to realize, however, that it is not directly based on ancient sources that mention frontier sanctuaries and link them to the definition of this so-called Ager Romanus Antiquus, but it is a modern reconstruction based on the interpretation of a variety of literary and epigraphic evidence that only in some cases can be connected to archaeological remains. The point of departure is a literary reference by Strabo in his Geographica. In this passage, Strabo describes the extent of ancient Rome and writes that between the 5th and the 6th stones, which indicates the miles from Rome, there is a place called Festori, and this, it is explained, is a boundary of what was then the Roman territory, and the priests celebrate there and at several other places as sacrifice. End of quote. This text has been instrumental in extrapolating from different kinds of evidence the existence of a set of frontier sanctuaries encircling Rome. This set of sanctuaries would correspond to the original Roman territory before expansion in the Republican period. So it should refer to the situation under Romulus or Numa or something in that chronological order. The core set of these sanctuaries consists of the sanctuary of Terminus at the 6th milestone of the Via Laurentina, a shrine of Mars at some point on the Via Appia, the temple of Fortuna Muliebris at the 4th milestone of the Via Latina, the shrine of Orobigus at the 5th milestone of the Via Claudia, and the sanctuary of Dea Dia at the 5th milestone of the Via Campana, as well as that site called Festori that Strabo mentions, and for which different locations have been proposed. However, as you may have guessed, there have been several problems with these, let's say, givens in our understanding of Rome and its colonies in the 43rd century BC. Just a series of books, but many articles, many research groups nowadays are working on this, and perhaps some of the deconstruction has been quite harsh, and we should perhaps at times be a little bit more nuanced in, let's say, throwing away what we thought we knew, but it is clear that many of this, what I just described, is indeed problematic. Perhaps the most clear example is the Capitolium Temple. In recent years, the reality of this Capitoline cult or a Capitolium Temple as such in colonies has been questioned. And we can think especially of the work by Ed Bispham, who has worked on this recently. And indeed, basically, there is clearly Capitoline cult in some places, in some moments, but very often it's very hard to reconstruct for the early time of the foundation of the colonies. So for the 4th to 2nd centuries BC, actually not much is there. Some colonies never get a Capitolian temple, many of them much later. So indeed, we can say that this image of the Capitoline cult for the mid-Republican colonies is indeed very problematic. Also, in the meantime, the potential importance of other pre-existing or new tutelary deities of colonial communities has been explored. And this further qualifies, or at least contextualizes, the role of the Capitoline model for colonial communities. This has been a very important move, I think. However, also, a bit less prominently, the idea of this sacred demarcation of the city-state has been problematized as well. And it's interesting to see that this has even happened for the city of Rome itself. In an important study by Adam Ziolkowski in 2009, who has seriously challenged both the evidence for the individual sanctuaries and their supposed link to Rome's original territory. And of course, a full discussion of his arguments is beyond the scope of this presentation, but I will just mention a few points that are really important. First of all, Ziolkowski convincingly exposes the circular reasoning behind many territorial interpretations. Shrines like that of Mars should likely be excluded, and supposed frontier features often reflect modern assumptions rather than ancient realities. And indeed, it shows quite neatly that methodologically any cult site within 5 to 6 miles of Rome was arbitrarily labeled a frontier sanctuary just because it was located there. Some of Ziolkowski's criticism are less compelling, such as the assumptions about the necessary military character of the frontier deities. Yet, despite some reservations, Ziolkowski's central point remains. It is highly unlikely that these sanctuaries marked something called the Ager Romanus Antiquus. The territorial associations of most cults appear to be late constructions, with key evidence such as Ovid's Fasti and Strabo's account of the Ampervalia, reflecting rather late Republican or Augustan context than earlier practice. So important to realize that this does not mean that it did not ever exist, but that it is quite difficult to argue for the 4th, 3rd, and early 2nd century BC, which is important because this is the main moment of expansion in Rome. So this is important for a whole complex of arguments about the success of the Roman Empire. So it's also interesting to consider that the archaeological evidence is very limited. Actually, only the Lucus Dei Idea has yielded rich imperial material, but also there is very few earlier evidence at that cult site too. So probably we must conclude that, one, the sanctuaries probably never demarcated the early Roman territory. Second, that they may never have had a territorial function. Or third, that such a role developed later as part of the late Republican or Augustan reinvention of Rome's past. In this sense, Rome may have served as a deceptive archetype when scholars used it to interpret mid-Republican colonization. This conclusion is quite disturbing because precisely the Roman situation was paramount in the argument that the territory of Latin colonies was demarcated by frontier sanctuaries. So what about the evidence for frontier sanctuaries in the colonies themselves? I have looked really hard, but only for a number of mid-Republican colonies do we have enough information about the territory of the colonies and of any extra-urban sanctuaries located in it for the time period that interests us here. Literary references are usually weak at best. Perhaps one reference in the corpus Argumentorum, but it's not really compelling because it doesn't relate to sanctuaries as such, and most of it dates after the Republican period anyway. Also, the archaeology does not help because even well-known Latin colonies do not suggest a city-state model with frontier shrines marking the borders. It appears that overall, no attempts were made at monumental demarcation in terms of architecture, large objects, inscriptions, and so on. And that is significant in itself, because such efforts can be, and famously, of course, in Greece and in the Greek colonies, have been recognized. It is also not the case that we do not find any remains from cultic activity in Latin colonial territories. On the contrary, but they do not fit the model of a frontier sanctuary. Even in colonies that were established in previous Greek towns, where a frontier demarcation could be expected a priori, such as in Posidonia, Paestum, we do not see a pattern that the territorial boundaries were marked by cult sites, and actually that some of the potential Greek territorial sites are in disuse, and that other sites instead pop up, not coinciding at all with the territory of the colony. But also in the colonies of Ariminum, so Rimini, Fregelle in Campania, and Albafucens in Abruzzo, that you just see, no such sanctuaries have been found in correlation with the territorial boundaries. So I have some images here. This is the colony of Fregelle in Campania, 328 BC. Also here, we do not see a ring of cult sites demarcating the territory. This is the reconstruction of the ancient territory of the colony. The sanctuaries are so near to the colony that you have to have an inset to actually see them. And also at Rimini, Ariminum, this is again the reconstructed frontier of the colony. And again, we do see extra-urban sanctuaries, but not located in association with these territorial boundaries. At Alba, the situation is even worse because within the reconstructed territory of the colony, there are no sanctuaries or extra-urban sanctuaries at all. Now, where does this leave us? Because, as we've seen, this deconstruction is not on its own, remembering the discussion about Capitolian temples, comitia, and other similar structures. One aspect that deserves more attention is the fundamental association between urbanism and Roman colonization. Indeed, crucially, and against the modern usage of the term in Roman studies, a colonia is not a town. Especially during the 20th century, the concepts of colonies and towns have merged, and consequently colonization and urbanization have become almost synonymous. Yet although most primary settlements attached to colonial communities had or developed urban features at some point in history, the two cannot be equated, not even on a basic conceptual level, because a colonia is a group, a community of settlers, and not a physical place. Many colonies were in reality established in towns that have existed already for centuries, just seen Paestum. Groups of colonists sent out to areas with different settlement traditions may have modified or built towns as they saw fit, but we have no reason to assume that what happens in towns necessarily reflects colonization, or that we should necessarily expect anything to change on an urbanistic level with the arrival of a community of settlers in that area. We therefore have to disconnect urbanism and Roman colonization, even as a method or a way to rethink this, and to develop new ways to understand, rather than take for granted, the morphology of the colonial community and its spatial distribution over a territory. And perhaps that such a spatial perspective can help better understanding the societal model of early colonies and also the role of cults within it. And I hope to become a little bit more concrete now, because in an attempt to contribute to this discussion with the Landscapes of Early Roman Colonization project, we indeed aimed to use landscape archaeology to shed light on the character of these early Roman communities, colonial communities. In most colonial settlements, the walled areas of the central colonial sites are far too small to have accommodated all colonists. So we really have to think about rates of 70, 80% of colonists that must have lived outside walls. Usually, indeed, a very large percentage of the colonists must have lived outside walls, and we have made several estimations for this, and indeed, with the exception of Cales, we are always at these very, very high levels of people living outside of the walled area. And as for the urban centers, also for the rural territory, of course, strong normative expectations exist. And we just mentioned the Cincinnatus model, the idea that farmers would work in a neatly divided landscape with a division system, equal parts of land to work. And the assumption, of course, here is that the early colonists were farmer soldiers. On this view, the frugal colonists would have established mononuclear farms on their plots of land, whose equal size would neatly reflect the equality of the members of the colonial community. These colonist farms would then correspond with the land division, and the regular dispersion of farms is thus expected by the conventional view of Roman Republican colonization. And here you see an image of this in a study of 1988 by Moscara. And interesting, this model actually fits very neatly in broader schemes of the development of civilization, social evolution. So the key scheme here, what we're looking at, is of course the classic idea of societal evolution. So schematically speaking, we should, with the arrival of the Roman colonists, witness a change from a tribal, village-based society, you can see here, with a hill fort and some unorganized farms outside. And indeed, a development towards the city-state with regular lands and land plots. And this is, of course, exactly how Roman Republican expansion has been characterized. And the main force of Roman expansion has been explained this way. The good thing about a visualization is that we can translate this quite easily into settlement patterns. So we can clearly see how we could expect a transition from nucleated patterns to some nuclei, in this case over here, in the, let's say, tribal phase, and a much more regular organization of the landscape in the city-state. And such a model can be tested on the ground, and that is exactly what we did in our project. By studying settlement patterns in colonial territories, we want to see if we can document the expected social evolutionary leap forward induced by the Roman colonists. And in order to do so, we've done fieldwork in 2 colonial areas, in 2 different landscape zones. One is Isernia in Molise, which we already talked about. And the other colony where we have worked most is in Venusia, nowadays Venosa in Basilicata. Besides that, we also do fieldwork in exactly the same way with the same teams of people, even in non-colonial areas, to provide a comparison. Because rather often, as a result of different disciplines or different developments of methodologies, it's quite difficult to compare archaeological data that have been collected by Romanists in Roman areas, in Roman towns, as opposed to, for instance, prehistorians or people interested in the italic population. So it's really important to have a very strict way of working in the same way, so we can really compare these data sets well. So Isernia was established by Rome in the wake of the Samnite Wars in 263 BC, as I said. Indeed, Toynbee saw this as, you can read it, the most striking of all the examples of Rome's use of city-states as instruments for extending and safeguarding her power were to be seen in Samnium. And that was a good reason to have a look in Isernia. In 2011 already, we started our field research in Isernia. By a series of long and intensive fieldwork over the years, we have covered nearly every accessible field in a research area of about 125 square kilometers. The methods range from so-called field survey. This is our basic way of working, which we study every field with teams of students and archaeologists. We collect all material, and in the end, you study material and make maps of different densities of material, and then you can make an estimation of where the most important settlements are and where they are not. Another method is LiDAR, so using an airborne laser to measure height differences. This is very good for instance, the hill forts that we are studying. As you can see also through the foliage of vegetation. And also geophysics, which only can be used in smaller portions of the landscape. And the PSR has a long tradition in this. We also studied as many sites as possible with this type of data. And then, especially, we have been really interested in using different methods of aerial recognition. This is indeed a powered paraglider. I'm not sure if this is going to work. Well, that's pretty matter. And this has been one of our favorite tools, actually, in the Molise landscape, where it's really hard to do this on a standardized basis with larger airplanes, and rather this way, together with drones, we have been able to get a much better understanding of this landscape with relatively low resources. But using different methods, and especially, of course, these pedestrian surveys, we found over 50 new sites that could belong to the Roman colonial phase. However, the sites that we do find do not actually comply with the standard expectation of small colonist farms. So the intensive surveys and geophysics, for instance, reveal a broad range of different types of sites, from very large rural complexes to roadside settlements. And it is interesting to note that, of course, many colonial territories have been surveyed and many maps like this have been produced, but it is important to consider that, for instance, one such dot on our map here corresponds to this, well, rather large roadside settlement that would otherwise have been interpreted as a small colonial farm. So it really is important to make do as many soundings as possible to date and to check your material from the pedestrian survey. In any case, what we of course expected on the city-state model is this idea of mononuclear farms, regular distances from one another, so view from above. But we found something completely different. Indeed, what we did find is hamlets, concentrations of sites, of rural sites, villages, importance of the territory, but also with huge empty tracts between them. And what's more, we did this analysis also in Venosa, where we have been working, where actually quite similar results turned up. And we've also been studying other data sets from previous surveys, such as for COSA, archaeological, and also in that data set, we applied the exact same method. And indeed, you see there a pattern of nucleation rather than regular distribution that would be the expected model. So in sum, on the basis of the evidence that we collected until now, we can conclude that the rural settlement organization of these colonies sent out by Rome does not necessarily correspond with conventional expectations about the orderly territory around the central urban site. And knowledge about the early colonial central site of Isernia is very scarce because of the continuous settlement at the site. It's still a major town now. And the city walls, which seem to have been built in different phases, the remains of a Republican period temple, indeed, which had been interpreted as a Capitolium previously, are actually the clearest archaeological evidence at our disposal. So, as we've seen, the colony of Isernia has often been celebrated as the best evidence of the new Roman urban model being introduced by colonization into the primitive, non-urban Semite area. But just how urban was the colonial foundation in comparison to the existing pattern of settlement? The central settlement of the colony of Isernia is actually really small. It is just 9.6 hectares, and it can't be extended because it's like on top of a cliff. And we do not know whether at Isernia there was already a pre-Roman settlement. We do know, however, that there was a consistent number of sites of the larger category already in place in the wider area. So we have to think about sites like this. This is a very high land example, Monte Santa Croce, and there's between 8 to 10 of these hill forts around Isernia that are quite considerable, but are also very difficult to research because they're difficult to access. The erosion in those places is, of course, horrible. It's really hard to get archaeological data out of this. So we have turned to literally scratching the ground still get archaeological information out of this. Many students spent many hours in the burning sun working on this, but it worked. So we were indeed able, even at places that were quite, well, let's say, disheartening when you looked at it at first, but we're still able to get quite well-datable material out of it. This is black gloss ceramics, which is quite typical for the colonial phase. So we're always happy to see this because we can date it really well. And also other types of finds, as millstone turned up at one of those sites that you would otherwise never found. Because we found this also by our aerial surveys. Now, I won't discuss all these different examples in any detail, but just to give an idea about the size of these and the amount of finds that still comes from it is quite impressive. It is actually very good to have a simple map of this. With a comparison of the sizes of these different sites. So right here is the colony of Isernia, and there are many other sites that are smaller, but actually some of the really large hill fort sites that also have a large flat terrain and which could indeed be inhabited are much larger. So yeah, it is interesting to project the scale of this, and it is always hard to compare these data, especially because Isernia is now covered by modern buildings, so it's really hard to get any information out of that. But still, we see that these hill forts are of equal, or some even much larger size, and that they present also strong and impressive city walls, or walls in any case. And we also know that from excavations at Montevairano, which is one of those hill forts, deeper in the Semite inland, we indeed know that monumental streets cross the site. So this makes it hard to deny that site the definition of urban settlement. And the question is, to what extent our distinction between a Roman colonial site and a Semite hill fort is influenced by hindsight or by a prioristic categories that we bring with us when we go out and study the impact of Roman colonies in Samium. On our other case study, though, in Venusia, we may offer some suggestions for an alternative view of early Roman colonial settlement. So Venusia is also a Latin colony, the colony of the Latin Rite. It was established in 291. You see in ancient Lucania, some modern Basilicata, and a very different landscape, much longer rolling hills. And in the area where the colonial community settled in the early 1st century BC, we know already that there were very large village settlements already from at least the 6th, 5th centuries BC onwards. And these sites produce enormous quantities of pottery, and they have been mapped luckily by the former Italia teams of Professor Maria Luisa Marchi, and more recently by our collaborative teams from Leiden, Rome, Groningen, and Foggia, as we have done several resurveys of part of this territory. Now, the site of Venosa itself is certainly not much larger, but other than for Isernia, it is possible here to investigate the character of the earliest colonial settlements, because at Venusia, at least part of the colonial center has not been overbuilt by the modern town. In this way, we have been able to confirm that the colony was not founded ex novo, but was actually built on a previous site. In any case, also here it's hard to escape the impression that we should think again about applying the label of urban to one site and not to another, and to describe the process of Roman colonization as the radical introduction of a completely different societal organization. So also here, of course, this was the expectation. This is actually in the area of Venosa, but this is what we found. Concentrations of sites, villages, empty tracks. And again, here it can be useful to have an idea of the scale of these different sites. So on top we have Venosa, this is Isernia. This is the colonial center, and these are just some of the other settlements that we studied and that we intensively surveyed. And indeed, also let's say in terms of the amounts of material that come up in these different sites, it's not different from what we find in Venetia itself, so in the colonial area itself. So also in Venetia, we indeed investigated this rural territory, and interestingly, what we have been able to do here is to see what happened with the earliest colonial settlements that come in the area. So what we actually think to see is that in yellow, you see the pre-existing, let's say, Lucanian or Samnite villages or very large hamlets. And in black dots are the new Roman colonial period sites. And you see that they are actually not located in the best agricultural areas, but they rather seem to look for the marginal areas, so where there's not already settlement in itself. And this is interesting because this indeed sheds light on this, well, the big elephant in the room, of course, in this whole discussion, which is the fate of the indigenous non-Roman population in the area after the Roman colonization. What we think we see in this way is that we do not see a radical transformation into a Romanized agro town with the foundation of the colony. But if we were able to understand better the social relations in these areas, then we do think, it may well be actually that the social order of the Roman newcomers indeed had to adapt to the previous indigenous settlers. So we think that rather than the natural aspects of the area, the previous settlement has been the main determinative factor for the new settlers. And interestingly, only later, and perhaps even only in the 2nd century BC, the town itself seems to become a more dominant factor in the pattern of settlement. And then also not for that long, because quite soon afterwards, the Via Appia takes this role and really pulls all activity and settlement towards it. So in the colonized landscapes of Isernia and Venetia, we mapped a much more organic and adaptive settlement pattern with clusters in specific portions of the landscape that do not only follow natural resources, but instead take into account the previous indigenous settlement organization. And together with the notion that the urban centers can be small, again, not even 10 hectares in Isernia, this gives quite another impression than the urban model that would have supplanted the traditional societal models. Such findings do, I think, indeed qualify the explanatory power that has conventionally been attributed to urbanism as a motor of colonial expansion and imperial success. What does this new clustered view of early Latin Roman colonies mean for our understanding of the role of cults? Now let's go back to the other examples of colonial territories and the evidence for cult sites. As we concluded, there is no overlap in territorial borders and the presence of sanctuaries. But a better look may explain how this different, non-Greek sacred landscape may have worked. So to stay with the example of Isernia, we can note 4 things. First of all, it had a very small urban surface area. There are no convincing early signs of land division and programmed land use. And indeed, we rather see these different clusters of settlement. As to the cult sites, there's strong evidence for a central temple, moreover very close to the one in Sora. But the chronology is unclear because also it is not clear, and of course it's not clear whether it was a Capitoline cult at all. The temple podium is similar to the temple of Sora, founded in 303 BC, which indeed is 40 years earlier than the colonial Visalia was established in the area. So Ingrid Edlin-Barry actually reassured me that indeed there's no way of dating these profiles on style, and indeed there have been propositions that the Temple of Sora is actually a later development, perhaps even of the 2nd century BC, but we have experts in the room who can say more about that probably. In any case, it seems certain that Asernia could never have developed this Lipsius Cincinnatus style of colonial landscape. And how the different pockets of villages were coordinated or linked to the town can, alas, not be reconstructed. But we do have one very tantalizing inscription. On an altar of the 2nd century BC, a dedication to Venus is documented on behalf of a community that's called the Samnites in Coli. Something like the Samnites that live among us on the same territory. Though we cannot tell to what degree this collegium was integrated or not, it gives a tantalizing view on how pockets of indigenous or otherwise non-colonial inhabitants dotted the landscape, rather than assuming this perfect ethnically homogeneous territorial city-state. The colony of Ariminum is a particular example. A dense clustered settlement has been identified in the area called Covignano, which is about 3 kilometers southwest of the ancient center. And in this area, a substantial coal place that was in use already from at least from the 5th century BC appears to have been revitalized or even monumentalized after the founding of the colony in Ariminum in 268 BC. Indeed, there is a well-defined phase that corresponds to the beginnings of the mid-Republican colony. And this is proved, among other things, by black-glass pottery produced at Rimini itself. And there's also ample evidence for cult activity in the area. Column drums have been found, and italic Corinthian capitals attest to the existence of at least 2 different monumental structures. 2 temples, probably. And the most significant evidence in this context are these remarkable statues that were discovered in the area. One statue is clearly identifiable as Minerva with aegis and helmet, whereas the other one possibly represents Fortuna. As Enzo Lipolis has argued, the iconography of the statues, and especially their eclectic style, combining Greek and Central Italian elements, should date them to the 2nd century, to the 2nd half of the 3rd century BC. So coinciding quite neatly with the arrival of the first generations of colonists at Rimini. So apparently a substantial settlement site thrived during the earliest phase of the colony, and the related cult site was adorned with state-of-the-art sculpture that evoked at least 1 and perhaps 2 of Rome's hallmark deities at that time. More tantalizing evidence comes from the primary settlement of Rimini. A series of black gloss fragments have been found together there, and some of these mention Vici and Pagi. It is quite possible these cups were used in a ritual that connected the rural pockets of the population on the one hand, so the Vici and the Pagi, with the urban center on the other. So one could think of procession rituals binding these different communities in the town. Now, Alba Fucens, founded in the midst of the Apennine Mountains in 303 BC, is a special case. Also here, there's no Capitoline temple documented, and instead there are other slightly odd temples, as Ed Bispham has recently argued. And as we've seen within the, let's say, traditional reconstruction of the territory, there are no rural sanctuaries attested at all. But several cult sites related to Vicus-type settlements are known in the area from Latin inscriptions that have been found on the shores of the Fucine Lake. The first cult site, a settlement pair, is attested by inscriptions linking a Vicus Aninus to a cult site where the divine virtue of Valetudo was venerated. The earliest inscriptions date to the 2nd century BC, and the remains of building material, including limestone slabs, capitals, and column drums, can be connected with the cult and the settlement site. Another combination of settlement and sanctuary comes from the Vicus Supinum on the shores of the Futrine Lake. An inscription dated to the late 3rd century mentions the dedication of a statue of Victoria, so this is the one over here, on behalf of the Vicus Supinas, so the village of the Supinates. Archaeological remains found in the modern center of Terrasacco, which include a column drum and a capital, can indeed be related to this complex. It is tempting, of course, to interpret these early villages as geared towards the specific socioeconomic opportunities that are offered by the lake Fucinus and the presence of some major transhumance routes in this area. It makes sense that the early colonial patterning diverged here from the classical agricultural Roman town. In conclusion, the overall image that arises is that the all-encompassing city-state model cannot be reconstructed from the relevant evidence for the early phase. Firstly, the evidence points rather at local rural cult communities, which played a large role in early colonial society. Possibly, in some colonies, the pre-Roman landscape and population was not annihilated, but instead played a dominant role in the choice for where the newcomers settled. However, the fact that some cult sites and settlements predated the colony does not necessarily mean that it was the same people and cult active there. The taking over of strategic hubs, such as sanctuaries, is a common trait in history. And indeed, there's this important distinction between archaeological continuity, so indeed the continuity that you see in the material records, and the social, political, or ethnic continuity in this. And there is some evidence, we'll not discuss that today, for pre-Roman italic sanctuaries that indeed are taken over and used for different Romanized rituals, and so indeed catered for a totally different audience than or rather than that we are dealing with these ageless, continuing local traditions, which is a myth. Anyway, second, the integration of coming together of the colonial cult groups in the urban center is possible, but we do not have that much evidence for it. We do have this fragile evidence from Rimini in the form of the dedications by the Vici and the Pagi, and perhaps this could constitute a model of how such networks of rural pockets of colonists work together. It is clear, however, that for early Roman colonization, we have to envisage a much more articulated territorial dynamic. Cults definitely played a role in shaping these new formations, but in a much more fluid and complex way than we could have expected on the standard polyadic model. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Tessa, for that wonderful talk that really seems to challenge our ideas of what Roman colonies are, or at least my idea of what Roman colonies are. So we're going to open up to questions in the room, and I should remind our online audience as well that they can type their questions in the chat if they have any. I just asked the first one while people gather their thoughts. It seems then maybe what you're suggesting, this separation between colonization and urbanism, is this then, when the statement is made, we're going to found a colony, is this the beginning of a process that we should think of, rather than it's a single action, 5,000 people go out, they build a settlement, actually it's the beginning of a process of dribs and drabs and slowly taking over the territory?
Yes, thank you. No, indeed. Actually, this may be one of the solutions of what we see happening. Because indeed, actually, there are now two main models. The one is, well, the traditional model that we have talked about enough this night. And the other one is a negotiation model in which not much change is actually accepted or expected anymore. But if you look at the colonial communities, you do get a sense of a diaspora type of culture. So indeed references to Rome, but not on the statal level or on the governmental level, but on the personal level. So I do think that indeed you could think of the installation of a colony, the establishment of a colony, indeed not the foundation, could set off a process in which, in the end, something new is created, but then more agency can be expected from the colonists, from the settlers themselves. What perhaps is interesting to note is that actually I did too talk always about the foundation of colonies, but indeed, if you look at Livy, he usually talks about 6,000 people are being sent away. A colony was sent to. So it is indeed quite clear that he's not talking about towns, and somehow it has entered our historiography as if they were, but it actually is quite clear in literary records as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. That talk was excellent. I'm a Roman historian of the late Republic, and it's got me thinking here. In the late Republic, you've got a massive catalogue of disgruntled men that try and rebel against the state. And they always turn to the Italians for support, and the Italians always seem to get on board. And the literary evidence suggests that most of these, particularly the veterans, are quite unhappy at this point, and that never seems to get resolved right through to the fall of the Republic. So if we get rid of the urban model for these colonies and veteran settlements, would you say that that now warrants a new investigation into why, perhaps, or a new light as to why these Italians join in with these rebellions, if it's not such a homogeneous and sort of happy, peaceful community as we once thought?
I'm not certain if I understand your question right. So you mean that there was no incentive to send out colonies for the, let's say, disgruntled urban poor, or is it a different argument?
So if, I always had it, I think, and a lot of people did, that these were homogeneous colonies out there, a solid town, like Rimini, Little Rome, you know. But if they're not, and they're more spread out, they're little hamlets, they're not so united and everything, do you think that would encourage these people to rebel against Rome, because life out there maybe wasn't quite as good as we once thought?
Yes, that's an interesting thought. Well, actually, what I do think, and what I mean with disconnecting urbanism from Roman colonialism, is not that it's not possible that the two go together. And of course, there are examples in which this really can be an opportunity, and that may, in some cases, indeed work out, because in a way, of course, from the 2nd century BC onwards, you do see that many of these sites develop into towns that get a pull factor of themselves. So that's not, it's not that it has to be the opposite. It's rather that you cannot assume it from the beginning, and that you have to look at, well, let's take other food chains. What would make most sense? There's a marshy area and a small hill. Are you going to build a Romanizing aquatown, or are you rather investing in the resources that are already there, which is the most important transhumant route from Puglia that can be directly connected to the Via Valeria, or fishing, rather than that? So I'm rather thinking of these different opportunities in different landscapes that can lead to different forms of Roman colonialism, but we do not recognize as such then. Was that more or less? Yeah, sorry. No.
Stephen, unless it's a joint question. No.
I would like to ask your view. of road networks, because communication, even in rural area, especially Isernia, I was wondering if you have identified some routes, pre-Roman routes. Well, Ariminum, it's obvious, is the consular road. But like Venusia, for example, have you identified roads? Because roads are connected to the economy as well of these sites.
Yes, indeed. And I also think that there is a lot still to do also in this sense, that we need to think, so what were these routes mainly used for? So which type of economy needs which type of transport? So this is also something that we can really make much more work of, I think. Also in our project, we've still not investigated this in office yet, but I think it is a very important point indeed. A very nice example comes to mind is this possibility that the whole Campanian coastal area needs lots of fuel, wood. And indeed, the Samnite Hills are more or less the first area where you can really get large forests for that goal. And what would be the best way of transporting that to the Campanian areas? And I think indeed also small rivers and other streams can be taken into account in this.
Thanks, Tessa. That's fantastic. Some really interesting thoughts there. Mine's a very specific question, actually, just on this one on Nabal-Fucins and the one of Rimini as well. You show on both of these figures show an area of influence on this kind of dotted line around there. I was just, what's the data behind that? Why is that the area of influence?
Yeah,
Control.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's a very important question indeed. You mean the determination of the actual frontier? Yeah, indeed. Yeah, this is very interesting. I have spent a lot of time on this. So mostly it is based on 19th century scholarship, which was based on the tribus affiliations of, let's say, funerary stelae. So that would correspond to at least, so that would bring us back to the 1st century BC. Other ways of discerning has been the orography, so how hills and mountains work together. That is really problematic because indeed, in the very same vein, for transhumance, you may need rather a high ridge rather than a deep valley. So this is something that cannot be objectively reconstructed. But it is mostly from this time also in the Nissen and later Toynbee is working on it as well, for the exact designation of these areas. In some cases, of course, they have even been reconstructed on the basis of rural sanctuaries because these were the borders. So this is clearly a circular argument, and I've left them out of these examples, of course. But to be honest, I think it is way too restrictive, at least for the moment of colonial establishment here, to think in this neat territorial demarcations. And indeed, I think that these Viki and other villages may have very well constituted a large group of the colonists, but just in a different morphology than you would expect. That's
thanks, Tessa. I have a question about, I was really struck by your map of the new Roman settlements that appear in the territory around Venosa, where they seem to be avoiding or respecting these pre-Roman centers. And my question is essentially like, do you get a sense of how crowded that landscape was beforehand. So when we see these these new sites appearing in these kind of more buffery areas, is that quote marginal land, or is this excellent land that's not being exploited because they don't need to? Kind of what, what are they doing on all those little dots in the buffers? So.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. So actually, we think that indeed these areas that are being pre-elected for new, let's say, colonial settlers or settlement, it is indeed marginal also in the agricultural sense. So it's really poor areas, ravines, places where you would not usually think to set up your farm. So indeed, I think it is negatively influenced by the presence of the pre-existing societies that are, or society that's already taken place of taken hold of the best terrains in agricultural terms, and that is the main factor that we can distinguish. So it's not the vicinity to water is not the issue. As I said, later on in the 2nd century, then you see that it really switches towards a system that the Via Appia becomes really important, which is connected to Brindisi in 190 BC, I think. So that makes sense. But in the, there is no particular reason why to settle for these very narrow spaces in between.
Thank you very much. That was very interesting. Can you talk a bit more about the relationship between then these settlements and the populations around and the other settlements around that are not founded by Romans?
The relationships.
So the colonies, the Roman colonies, and the other populations that live in the same area.
Yeah.
Does that change the way we see these relationships?
Yes, I do think so. Actually, I think we are moving towards a model in which there's much more direct interaction because you cannot establish these types of settlements without running into one another. And of course, one option is always elimination, as every settler colonial project, unfortunately. But there may be examples where this is not the case, and where actually mutual profit can be made, if I may explain it in a bit economical terms. So I do think that in the previous way of thinking, there was a very rigid idea of Roman colonists and the non-Romans, Samnites, Marsi, or whatever, next to it, that were only influenced culturally or impressed by the technology to take it over, towards a model in which it can be expected that colonial settlers actually had to rely on local knowledge, on local technologies to make a living anyway in these first generations. So that is my my feeling, but it is very hard to find examples of this in practice. I may have a look if I have a slide on this, because we once were very lucky. Is there any way I can perhaps help me out? I have so many slides now, and I would like to have un'altra. No, alla fine, però non so dove. Ah, non c'è un modo per vedere tutti insieme. No. Così. Ah, ok. Non sembra. Boh. Scusate, so the problem, of course, is that we cannot, on the basis of ceramics, determine whether we're looking at real colonial settlers or rather other people using the same material culture. So this is a very hard thing for archaeologists in general. So we will always have to work with hypotheses of how how we can model these interactions when we look at a broader set of data. But I hope I have a very nice example of something. No, sorry. Okay.
Okay.
I can. So what we found in Venetia at one point is at one of those colonial farms, we found a tile with a stamp with the Latin alphabet and name Papius. Papius is a typical Sen-like name, so actually not original from the area, because we are in Lucania here. But apparently this Papius had set up his own well, small industry of terracotta because it links perfectly well with a loom weight that has been described by Mario Torelli a long time ago, and he believes that it's the same thing. So we do have evidence here for an immigrant apparently using the Latin language and alphabet to make himself understood in a colony which was in Lucanian territory. So sometimes we do have this kind of chance discoveries, but it doesn't happen often.
Sure, there are more questions for Tessa, but these can be asked at the reception afterwards. And the talk comes really at an important moment in the course as we start to move away from the city centre, and we're going to be going out onto the 4th mile of the Via Latina where the Temple of Fortuna is, and maybe encourage us to think about people coming to it rather than people coming from Rome to the sanctuary. Just before we go up, and everyone's invited, of course, to the reception, can we please thank the first of our speakers who's used paragliders in their research, maybe a case for BSR archaeology to do flying lessons or something like that. But before we go upstairs, can we please thank Tessa once again for a wonderful talk.